When the Sega Saturn launched in 1994, its hardware represented one of the most complicated in the history of consoles at that point. So much so that nearly 25 years later the machine's capabilities are still misunderstood, with countless misrepresentations making the rounds with retro gaming fans every single day. It doesn't help that the Saturn was a commercial failure, as its lack of exposure to the mainstream masses have helped fuel these myths, misunderstandings, and sometimes outright misinformation. If we are going to understand this nearly 25-year-old barrier and find our way to the truth, we will need to travel back to 1993 and understand the origins of the Saturn's hardware, Sega's thinking in its development, and how Sony influenced its final design. I'm Sega Lord X, and thank you for joining me on my journey to better understanding the 32-bit enigma that was the Sega Saturn. In 1993, with next-generation threats from Atari's Jaguar and the 3DO already on the market, Sega's Project Saturn is well underway. A team of hardware engineers led by Sega veteran console designer Hideki Sato began to take shape and finalize the hardware in Sega's own next-generation effort. Leadership at Sega had been very friendly with Hitachi, which naturally led the company to choosing the new Super H line of CPUs for the project. Sega was at its heart an arcade manufacturer first and foremost, and was no stranger to engineering hardware with multiple processors. This led Project Saturn's design philosophy, much like its arcade boards, in using multiple chips that would be harnessed in assembly language for potent results. Two Super H2 CPUs, or SH2 for short, would be the heart of the machine, with an additional custom geometry processor called the SCU, or Saturn Control Unit. Sega would then turn to a custom video display processor that would be derived directly from its Polygon arcade boards, the Model 1, Model 2, as well as the texturing methods used by Sega's System 32. This flies directly in the face of the near constant misinformation often seen on the internet that Saturn was designed as a two-dimensional machine first and foremost. It very clearly was meant to render polygons from the outset, with even the very first game demo shown in January of 1994, a full 10 months before the Japanese launch, all being polygonal games. In effect, every single game in development for Saturn as the hardware was finalized through late 1993 and early 1994 was fully intended to be three-dimensional from the outset. We can also ascertain another common falsehood to be eradicated here, as Sega had designed the Saturn to be a dual CPU system from the very beginning. A second SH2 CPU was not thrown in at the last minute to compete with the Sony PlayStation, despite internet blather to the contrary. That misunderstanding was actually born from the introduction of the Video Display Processor 2, or VDP2 as it would become known. This was actually the last addition to the Saturn's internals, and the answer to the more elegant design of the Sony PlayStation. You see, at some point in early to mid 1994, a developer that was friendly to Sega had witnessed firsthand the power and efficiency of Sony's new hardware, tipping Sega off that it appeared to be quite a bit more powerful than previously realized. This prompted Sega to design the VDP2 chip to assist the first VDP, basing its design again on some of Sega's previous arcade hardware, the System 24 and System 32. This new VDP2 chip was capable of rendering multiple background layers, as well as an infinite 3D textured layer that could be scaled and rotated at will. Sega's thinking here was simple. If VDP2 could render a three-dimensional ground or sky plane, VDP1 would be freed up to handle everything else. This chip was also capable of full hardware transparency layers, as well as methods of adding transparencies to VDP1's polygon rendering known as multi-texturing. Sega had once again operated under the logic of their arcade development experience, as they fully expected assembly language to harness these chips' additional abilities and bring the Saturn all the special effects and power developers would need. Again, Sega's arcade prowess was the fundamental building blocks of the Saturn's design and methodology. Sega had some of the best software designers in the industry, many of which had years of experience working with hardware with multiple processors, and it was believed that Saturn's architecture would be easily harnessed. With the Saturn hardware finished and its internal studios working on software, Sega was getting ready for its Japanese November 1994 launch. In order to get the most out of the Saturn's internals, each of Sega's teams had developed its engine from the ground up in assembly. As previously noted, this is how it had always been done with Sega's arcade hardware. In effect, turning your software teams loose and letting them cut to the metal of the hardware for the best results. They weren't constrained by pre-built engines or software tools, with the final output reflecting the software engineering skills of the team. This had always served Sega extremely well, with the end results being some of the most prolific software the arcade had ever seen. Sega's internal teams had always delivered that software that took every advantage of the hardware they were working with, and Sega was confident it would be no different on its new 32-bit console. Unfortunately, getting every piece of Saturn's hardware singing in unison was more difficult than Sega had hoped. Even with master software and hardware engineer Yu Suzuki overseeing the development of some of the games, it would take Sega longer than expected to get software where they wanted it for the Saturn. This in and of itself wouldn't have been a terrible thing, as launch software rarely shows the true potential of any console. Sega had also, within a year of the Saturn's launch, went from the glitchy and flat-shaded Virtua Fighter to Virtua Fighter Remix and its textured mapped polygons, to Virtua Fighter 2 and its high resolution and 60 frames per second. This was an impressive leap in quality for such a short amount of time. Sega had taken a year of bad press to get there, but finally the Saturn was showing it wasn't the incompetent mess portrayed by damn near every media outlet of the time. Had Sega's troubles ended with these impressive strides in understanding how to develop software for the Saturn, this story would likely have had a very different outcome. The problem was that while Sega had the talent and resources to eventually make the Saturn purr, third parties had absolutely been left behind to fend for themselves. The Sony PlayStation had been designed around a single chip that would house most of its main features and abilities. Approaching this environment even in the C language of coding resulted in impressive ease of use for third-party developers. Approaching the Saturn this way was an absolute mess. It often meant that developers would focus on the use of the master SH2 CPU, leaving the second SH2 CPU underutilized, and the SCU geometry chip not used at all. This meant that Saturn's VDP-1 processor would foot most of the work through limited use of its dual CPUs. VDP-2's infinite 3D playfields would also go unused in most games, as would its transparency abilities. This was simply not how Sega meant for the Saturn to be used to display 3D polygons, and unfortunately, it would be entirely their fault it came to this. While Sega had been working to figure out Saturn themselves in year one of its release, third parties had faced an absolute nightmare trying to get decent results from the machine. Most console developers had little to no experience with multiple CPU hardware designs, with even fewer having experience with dedicated graphics chips that handled separate parts of the final image. Worse, this had been the Wild West of 3D polygon development, where everything had come with a new learning curve due to the paradigm shift in how games needed to be made. Most multi-platform developers struggled to get their engines running at the same levels on both 32-bit machines. Just getting the Saturn version at a playable frame rate had been a victory, often meaning that special effects like transparencies and light sourcing would be scaled back or removed entirely. There is a huge swath of Saturn third-party multi-platform releases that show this difficulty in harnessing the Saturn's complicated internals. Time and time again, we would see mesh transparencies in place of the gorgeous work done on the Sony PlayStation. Even when the game should have been a great port on the Saturn, it often wasn't, lending more and more evidence to the argument that Saturn was grossly underpowered. Yet a quick look at the software design for the Sega Saturn from the ground up in comparison to those multi-platform disappointments almost always yields clarity to how things really were. These games typically not only would run better in regards to frame rate, but they would also use the Saturn's custom hardware abilities to their fullest extent. Games like KO Flying Squadron 2 would feature heavy use of the Saturn's VDP-2 processor, painting beautiful full-screen transparency effects all over the place. And you'd see it time, and time, and time, and time again. Great running games sporting transparencies everywhere. You'd see it in shoot-'em-ups, platformers, RPGs, and fighting games. Where dialogue overlays in multi-platform games were almost always mesh, in Saturn games built from the ground up, they were beautiful transparencies done by VDP-2. While the Saturn lacked the flexibility of using transparencies in every situation like its competitors, a little forethought and smart design choices could still render great results. Even in fully 3D games, transparencies and light sourcing were possible with the Saturn's abilities fully realized. You'd see this in first-party games like Sonic R with its fully transparent tracks, and Burning Rangers and numerous special effects, but even third parties would figure this out eventually, with games like Loaded painting transparencies all over the place in a fully polygonal environment. A few third parties even managed to get the Saturn's complicated internals to produce some truly stunning results as well. Lobotomy Software landed Power Slave on the machine in 1996 using a proprietary engine known as Slave Driver. This engine would feature proper dual CPU support and use the often ignored abilities of VDP-1 and VDP-2 extensively. This engine would go on to power that generation's best home version of Duke Nukem 3D for the Saturn, an extremely faithful recreation of the PC first-person shooter mega hit. Lobotomy Software would also go on to pull off one of the Saturn's greatest technical achievements, Quake. The balls on these guys to even think they could take a game like Quake, which took a pretty beefy PC at the time to play, and make it a decent experience on a home console was unbelievable. They did just that too, putting out a product that simply shouldn't have been possible, especially on a machine that had the reputation for being a joke at rendering polygons. As the Saturn would age a few years, third parties would begin to see the results of using the machine's abilities properly, and we'd see even more visually impressive games. These games would give us a glimpse at what could have been had software development reached a mature stage on the Saturn and allowed the hardware to truly be exploited. Alas, the Saturn's lack of worldwide success had taken its toll on Sega and their partners, and 1997 would be the last year the machine would see major support across all regions. There simply hadn't been a lot of money made in the Saturn market to justify continued support, and as they say, the rest is history. Even as a diehard Sega supporter, you can't help but to blame Sega for the fortunes of the Saturn. Had Sega developed the proper tools sooner to get third parties on board with how to get the most out of Saturn's proprietary design, things could have been very different. Aside from the obvious mistakes like launching the machine too soon in North America, this is perhaps Sega's biggest folly. Saturn had been a complicated machine for even the arcade experienced Sega engineers to harness in those early days, leaving third parties to make a rather easy decision: support Sega and have increased development time and increased resource expenditures, or go with Sony, the new kid on the block that was giving third parties everything they needed to succeed. This choice was pretty damn simple to everyone in the market back then, and you can't blame any of them for going the route they chose. Even so, the adventure that had been the Sega Saturn was still one I'm glad I was part of. I got to play many games that never would have existed without its canvas for developers to create on. No doubt Sega's hardware makeup was the source of many of the machine's problems, but it was also the source of many of the machine's triumphs. These triumphs were indeed an enigma to many, but for those of us that were along for the ride back then, it was an incredible journey beginning to end.